Welcome to the Graduation Equity Webinar Series. I'm Kefi Andersen. I'm a System Improvement Program Supervisor Lead at OSPI. And today we're talking about getting proactive with threat assessments. This meeting is being recorded. It should be available this afternoon on YouTube. We do have closed captions available if you want to take advantage of that. And we'll be posting our PowerPoint intermittently today. Just to see if people get it that way. We always get questions about the PowerPoint, so you will be getting a copy of that in the chat. This webinar is brought to you through the Office of Student Engagement and Supports, and that's within the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. At OSPI, we believe each student needs to be prepared for post-secondary pathways, careers, and civic engagement. The Graduation Equity Webinar Series was created with the purpose of highlighting practices that increase access to education and ultimately to graduation. Through our webinars, we're striving to go beyond equality, to think about the opportunities that we have to examine and dismantle current policies and practices that result in disparate outcomes for our students, with the ultimate goal of ensuring that each student has access to the instruction and the support that will make them successful in school and in life. I want to share with you this ancestral lands map. On my walks, I've noticed an abundance of moss, and I've been really enjoying our foggy mornings while my kids are still hoping for some snow. We ask that the participants of this meeting honor the ancestral lands on which each of you are located today, and we have links in our resource sheet to help you. In my life, I mostly travel around the intersection of the ancestral lands of the Squaxin Island, the Coast Salish, the Cowlitz, and the Nisqually tribes. I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial and who still live here today. I'd also like to encourage you to take part in tribal consultation. It's a great way to get to know the local tribes and begin those relationships that benefit students and their families. But we'd love to connect you with our Office of Native Education if you'd like more information on that too. And I'm just checking out the chat. I'm seeing folks from Squaxin, Duwamish. I'm seeing Snohomish, Tulalip, Chehalis. Welcome, Spokane. Okay, cool. We've got a really nice showing today. Thank you for being here. As a team, we want to include a trigger warning. We're talking about some school violence topics today. And they may be sensitive for many of you. Threat assessments are intended to identify students who need support and to provide it for them. And we recognize that this might be a difficult topic for some of our participants, and we want to encourage you to just take care of yourself and your well-being. If you need to go, that's totally okay. We understand you don't need to explain yourself or anything. So we're also asking that our audience members be especially sensitive today and treat one another gently. I know just talking about violence at school can be upsetting, and we want to take care of one another and come at this topic with a sense of collective compassion. The reason we chose this topic is that maintaining a sense of safety is important in every school. And sometimes when a threat is made, school leaders aren't prepared to respond, so they may over or underreact. We want you to be ready if there is a threat of violence, to be able to assess it with confidence and know who to turn to. Threat assessments can help schools to manage bias in referrals and provide meaningful supports. Also wanted to note that January 16th is Martin Luther King Jr.'s Day of Service. Dr. King believed in activism, and MLK Day is a great day to advocate for racial justice, inclusion, fair policies to better serve low-income families. It's a great month to encourage students to consider what they stand for and help them navigate power structures that they can influence too. As a result of this webinar, we want everyone to walk away understanding the purpose and importance of threat assessments. We want you to understand the requirements for threat assessment programs, policies, and procedures. And we want to introduce you to resources and contacts at OSPI and your ESDs that'll help you with your threat assessment program. I brought with me from OSPI, DeVerse. She's our School Safety Center Program Supervisor Lead. And she has brought with her Eric Madfis. He is an author, an associate professor at the School of Social Work and Criminal Justice at the University of Washington, Tacoma. We like to get to know our audience so we can see who is here. So we have a poll just asking about your role, what's your grade band, and how familiar you are with this topic. And we'll give a sec to do that. I see some Husky fans in the chat. Lots of good mornings. And if your category isn't in here, feel free to tell us in the chat what your role is. So I'm gonna end the poll, and if you didn't get a chance to participate, there will be more, so don't worry. With us today, we've got quite a few counselors, administrators, lots of district office folks, and ESD staff and OSPI staff as well. We have quite a few in the middle or high school or both category, and people feel somewhat knowledgeable about this topic, it looks like. So, and some people are very knowledgeable about this topic. So I think that we can go deep on these things. I am gonna give some slide control. Ella DeVerse is our Safety Center Program Supervisor Lead. She's going to tell us a little bit about School Safety Center and give us some background information on threat assessments. So Ella, welcome. Take it away.
Thanks, Kefi. I'm very excited to be here. As Kefi mentioned, I am the lead program supervisor for the School Safety Center at OSPI. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of the state perspective and background on threat assessment. Oops. As I mentioned, I am the lead program supervisor for the School Safety Center. And within the Safety Center, we work with multiple different programs under that umbrella of safety and well-being. We have programs such as harassment, intimidation, and bullying, comprehensive school safety, suicide prevention, behavioral health, school safety and security officers. And then we also have threat assessment, which is the main topic that we are here to talk about today. Oh, sorry, absolutely.
You're really fast, sorry.
No, I'm glad you said something. So as I was saying, in the School Safety Center, we have multiple topics under the realm of school safety and student well-being. And those include programs such as harassment, intimidation, and bullying, comprehensive school safety, suicide prevention, behavioral health, and then threat assessment, which is the one that we are specifically here to talk about today. There are a lot of reasons that we wanted to bring this topic to all of you. Part of it is that it's a fairly new program within the state of Washington. And while we have some regions and school districts that have been practicing threat assessment for many years, some as much as over a decade, it's still new for a lot of the state. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about what this program actually is and the intention of this program. really, we are here to kind of help you understand and demystify that idea of threat assessment. Overall, threat assessment is positive, and it is a method of prevention for school safety and student well-being. And in a lot of ways, I like to look at it as wraparound services for students that are in need. In the spring of 2019, House Bill 1216 was passed. And within that legislation, there were some very specific requirements for OSPI, the 9 educational service districts, and also for school districts. Within those requirements was the information that came across for school-based threat assessment. At OSPI, we are required to have people there to provide technical assistance, training, etc. And then also at the ESDs, which I'll talk a little bit more in a little bit, we do also have point people there that are trained individuals in threat assessment to help districts. But I wanted to focus just for a moment on those requirements that exist for school districts when it comes to threat assessment. RCW 28A 320-123 authorizes threat assessment within school districts. And it stated that by the beginning of the 2020-21 school year, districts needed to adopt policy and procedure, and that is WASDA 3225 and 3225P, and also establish school-based threat assessment programs. So some of you may notice that that school year definitely coincides with right in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So we did have a few districts that I think are still trying to catch up to that, and that is okay. That's part of the reason we are here today to talk a little bit more about it. So school-based threat assessment in Washington State, as I mentioned, we do have those school district requirements where each district should have that school-based threat assessment team in place at this time, and they should have adopted those policies and procedures. To assist districts in this, we have a threat assessment coordinator at each of the 9 educational service districts in the state. So those are the ESDs for those of you that are familiar. And we're actually lucky that we have some of these ESDs that have more than one threat assessment coordinator on staff to help their districts. They are there to help with technical assistance, and they offer trainings multiple times throughout the year to help districts really get a good grasp of what they need to do in terms of threat assessment. Across the state, at OSPI and the 9 ESDs, we have adopted the use of the Salem-Keizer Cascade Threat Assessment Model. That is a model that comes directly out of Oregon, and is actually created specifically for use in a school and was created in a school district. The importance of this is that the adoption of that consistent model provides equity-based protocol. And it also allows us to provide training and technical assistance based on a consistent model across the state to help better serve you in districts as they try to implement these programs to fidelity. So as I mentioned, the Salem-Keizer Cascade model does come with an equity lens, which is incredibly important in this work. And a couple of the things to note about this equity lens is that it does help to provide that perspective of cultural sensitivity. It supports safety, inclusion, and connection, which is also incredibly important. It helps to identify concerns from our underserved and underrepresented populations who may underreport or may lack confidence in certain systems within the school. This model and the equity lens really does base this information on facts and the actual behavior of the student. And it helps our people who are engaging in this process and our threat assessment teams from making those assumptions about students, the incident and or the behavior. So you know a little bit now about what district requirements are. You know who you have at the ESDs to help and the model that we're using. So what is threat assessment? That's probably the most common question that we get. So it's a structured multidisciplinary process. It involves multiple people to make sure you get multiple different perspectives on the situation. It really is a primary purpose of preventing targeted violence. As I mentioned before when we were talking about the equity lens, is that it really is an analysis of the facts. It's an evidence of the behavior in each situation. It is student specific and it's situation specific. And it really does focus on those situational variables and not demographic characteristics, which is incredibly important when we're talking about this process. So in a nutshell, threat assessment is preventative trauma-informed process, and it uses early interventions to keep students safe and engaged in school. I think something that's really important to note here is we really are looking at positive school climate. That is one of the main intentions of threat assessment, is to make sure we are continuing and maintaining that positive school climate for students, educators, and everyone within the school community. School-based threat assessment really has three main objectives to it. The first objective is to assess threats of potentially harmful or lethal behavior and determine the level and concern of action required. The second objective, organize resources and strategies to manage situations involving threatening situations that pose a risk of harm to others. And then that final objective is to maintain a sense of psychological safety within the community. So when do we conduct a threat assessment? There are many times that a threat assessment may be conducted. There could be a situation where we have concerns regarding school violence and safety. To know if a threat is real, maybe a threat has been made, and we want to make sure that we know, is this something that we need to react to? To know how to respond to a threat, which is incredibly important. And then also to make sure that when we respond, that we don't overreact or underreact. And overall, to improve the quality of safety in our schools, and once again, to improve that school climate overall. I did want to note during this webinar, there's a lot of confusion when it comes to threat assessment and discipline, and it is made very clear within the legislation. But overall, threat assessment is not a disciplinary process. It is distinct from those student discipline procedures. And there are times where discipline procedures may be occurring at the same time and running parallel to that threat assessment process, but threat assessment on its own is not a disciplinary process. As I mentioned, in a lot of ways, this is jumping in to provide support to students to figure out how we can support them best. One of the things to note in terms of our legislation is that House Bill 1216 and the RCW 28A 32123 very specifically says that threat assessment, that the need to do one or the referral for a threat assessment cannot be the sole purpose of a suspension or an expulsion for students, which I think is important to note. There may be other reasons that something disciplinary may occur, but a student cannot be suspended or expelled solely for the purpose of a threat assessment being referred or being completed. So that's kind of that brief overview of what we have going on at the state, those requirements and those assistance that we have. I wanted to just take a minute to let everybody know that we have a wonderful, amazing team at OSPI, people who are there to support with multiple different programs, including behavioral health, social workers, we have suicide prevention, and then we also have our own business analyst as well to help us with all that amazing data we like to pull together. So if you have questions or concerns about this program or any other programs within that school safety center, we are here to assist you and to help as much as we possibly can. And that is the end of what I have for you today. Are there any questions?
Ella, I'm seeing one in our Q&A, but we are going to talk about that a little bit later today, so I think we're okay for right now.
Yeah.
For our main speaker today, we've got Eric Madfis. He's a PhD. He's an associate professor of criminal justice. His research focuses on the causes and prevention of school violence, hate crimes, and mass murder. He received his PhD in sociology from Northeastern University in Boston. And that is where he was a research associate at the Brudnick Center on Violence and Conflict. He often teaches courses on criminological theory, sociology of deviance and social control, criminal homicide, juvenile justice, and diversity and social justice and criminology. As a nationally and internationally recognized expert on school and mass shootings, Dr. Madfis has spoken to audiences across the country and around the world about his research, including to the United States Congress. The Washington State Legislature used his research on the prevention of mass school shootings to inform the passage of some recent legislative mandates implementing non-biased threat assessment procedures in public schools across the state. He is the 2018 recipient of UW Tacoma's Distinguished Research Award. He's been published in numerous journals. He's the author of How to Stop School Rampage Killings, Lessons from Averted Mass Shootings and Bombings, and co-editor of a forthcoming book, All American Massacre. Eric, welcome. We're glad to learn from you today. Why don't you begin by telling the audience a little bit about your research?
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here and to talk about my research on school violence prevention and threat assessment, and to have an opportunity to discuss, and answer any questions you guys have about what research shows to work, what threat assessment is, how various versions differ, and how best to implement some threat assessment practices. And so I've done a lot of work in this area on threat assessments, on school discipline, on a sort of school to prison pipeline and sort of those kind of issues. But a lot of my work is specifically on the causes and prevention of school violence and on school shootings, particularly mass school shootings. And how we react to them, how we fear them, and particularly how we actually sort of address them and prevent them from happening. And so I'll mention, sort of as a way of introduction, why would someone, devote their career to studying such a pleasant and uplifting topic as school shootings? And part of that really does relate to my own sort of experiences when I was in high school. The tragedy at Columbine High School that occurred in my junior year, when I was a junior in high school in April 1999. And after that, there was this, this fear that these types of shootings were going to happen all over the place. There are polls that at the time that people expected one to happen. Mass majority of people expected them to happen in their schools. And there were copycats, and a number of them after that, and there have been, we've seen increase of these over the course of the last 20 years. But at this time, particularly right after Columbine, there was this sort of full-scale moral panic that occurred. This fear, sort of that it was going to happen all the time, everywhere. There was sort of this reaction against, students who look different or dress different, and extra sort of focus on them. And so that was sort of the general disciplinary, sort of the general climate that was happening when an incident happened at my high school. This is about a year after Columbine. This is the spring of 2000, when basically someone had written some graffiti on a boys' room stall. And they wrote something to the effect of, Columbine could happen here. And they wrote a date that was about a month in the future. And this was widely circulated around the school community, and teachers, parents, and administrators discussed, what you should do. Ultimately, the decision was made to proceed with school on that day as normal. But basically, because of this fear, there were very few people in class throughout the day. There's about 3 or 4 students in every class throughout the day. And so what happens to me that day, sort of at the end of my last day of my last class of school that day, I have physics class at the end of the day. I'm walking to my locker with a good friend of mine. And now this friend of mine was not necessarily the best student, or even necessarily the least truant student, but certainly not a violent person, had no history of that kind of behavior, either inside or out of school. But what happens is, as I'm walking to my locker with my friend, he says to me, "Boy, today sure was disappointing." Those were his exact words. Unfortunately, he says this just as we're turning a corner. And as we turn this corner, the vice principal, one of the vice principals sort of turns around the corner at the exact same moment, overhears this, and basically it gets interpreted as a threat. And he is given a lengthy suspension. But as a result of this sort of experience, he's made to feel kind of unwelcome at the school, and sort of just really kind of discouraged from returning. And basically he drops out, and that's his last day of high school. And so, did he write the graffiti in that bathroom? Definitely not. Did he mean that today was disappointing because there weren't sufficient people, on that day to kill? Definitely not. Was he maybe making a sarcastic comment about the disappointing lack of excitement on a day that so many people hyped up and expressed fear about? Maybe it was sort of, teenage boys talking to each other in a sarcastic way. I think that's possible, but it's equally plausible that he just was expressing annoyance at a day where we basically sat through classes and teachers couldn't teach anything because there were so many people absent. So there's numerous ways to interpret that what he said, but ultimately it was sort of interpreted as a threat. And this sort of made sense in the context of the time, which was the height of this zero tolerance sort of culture and that policy being sort of applied. And what that sort of means, basically, zero tolerance policies where you have strict punishments sort of uniformly applied to everyone, regardless of individual context or circumstances. So, sometimes extreme penalties for what would previously have been perceived as minor infractions. So everyone gets the same punishment, regardless of, what their intent was, regardless of circumstances. And sometimes with mandatory suspensions or expulsions, or even arrests sometimes for sometimes minor infractions. And this also, I think, is important to note, actually exacerbated sort of the disproportionate punishment for students of color that has kind of always existed, but this certainly exacerbated that, which is interesting because it was in part meant, designed to try to be more neutral, but the sort of outcome of that really was additionally sort of disproportionate punishment for students of color in particular. It's also worth noting that there's really no evidence that zero tolerance policies, this kind of harsh punishment, has any success, any empirical sort of proven success in crime reduction. We've had more school shootings, since they've been initially imposed in the 90s. Also, sort of substantively, excluding students from school doesn't de-escalate conflicts, doesn't resolve problems. And in fact, there's been several cases where these kinds of punishments, suspensions or expulsions, exacerbated the anger of previous school shooters who viewed sort of this experience as a last straw, kind of before their attack. So problematic in a number of ways. And so seeing what happened to my friend sparked my initial interest in school shootings, and particularly the significance of understanding a more measured, reasonable, and an effective way to respond and to prevent these events, and to not overreact to sort of simplistic statements that are made in this kind of a way. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of my research over the years. And I'm talking a little bit about my recent book, How to Stop School Rampage, where I looked at averted incidents of school shootings. So a crucial way to understand how you actually prevent these types of events is to actually look at the cases that have been stopped, that have been averted before people were harmed. And so there's been a lot of research over the last 20 years on school shootings and mass shootings increasingly, but very little on averted incidents. And so I looked at these kind of cases. I found 195 cases across the United States during this 10-year period that I looked at, where there was a plot to kill 2 or more people, their peers or school staff, which was prevented, and basically no one was injured. And this I should mention, this ranged a great deal from some cases where there was just someone had a list of people they didn't like, to much more sort of, I think, pretty extreme instances where there was, someone had amassed an arsenal of weapons in his room, had practiced making pipe bombs at home, had made homemade napalm, all these kinds of things, and had a list of people he wanted to hurt, and maps of the school, really extreme stuff. So there's a range of things here at the cases that I looked at. And so I was ultimately granted access to 11 public schools that had averted these attacks. And I did in-depth interviews with people directly involved in averting the incidents. So administrators, like, superintendents and principals and vice principals, school psychologists, school social workers, security officers and police officers, and teachers. And that this was sort of checked against, all the information I could find, about these cases, including news reports, court transcripts, legal briefs, and police incident reports, because sometimes you find, different things from different sources, unfortunately. And so this is really crucial because a lot of the policies, particularly school safety policies that we've implemented over the course of the last 20 years, really don't necessarily have an empirical basis to them, aren't based in evidence, unfortunately. So if we talk about things like metal detectors in schools, random locker checks, security cameras, arming teachers, all these kind of things, really there's not any sort of empirical evidence in the aggregate to say that these things actually prevent school shootings, and there's not even sort of anecdotal evidence either, really. If you look at these things, there's not really cases where that's the case. And so, and I argue that there are ways in which this could also be counterproductive and harmful in many ways, in harming the sort of the positive school environment, and creating a place where you have a sound pedagogical environment. And so that's the case because when we look at what actually did prevent these things, first, it really was sort of the case that in the vast majority of situations, there is a vast majority of situations, there's this thing called leakage, which is a Secret Service term, which basically means that people tell other people about their plans, whether they threaten other people, whether they warn other people, don't come to school next Tuesday, I want you to be safe, or they try to recruit other people. In the vast majority of cases, there's this example of leakage of students who are planning this stuff, telling often their peers. And so it's really crucial that when students are exposed to that leakage, exposed to that information about threats, that they come forward. And the best way to do that is to have a positive school environment. And so it's crucial that the cases that were averted, these were cases where students did come forward to counselors or administrators or teachers or school resource officers. And there's lots of research that shows that how do you create if you create a positive school environment, that will increase reporting behaviors for not just, extremely serious situations like, mass shootings, but also that's the case for instances of domestic violence or bullying, sexual assault. It increases sort of reporting behavior if you have an environment where students trust the people in the building. They don't see that they're going to just get punished themselves, for example, if they come forward with these zero tolerance policies, and that they feel like they can trust the people and that they'll be taken seriously if they come forward. So that environment is crucial. And the second component of this is sort of threat assessment that was based on how detailed, direct, developed, and actionable the plots were. And I'll talk more about what that means. But as opposed to what more problematic forms of sort of risk prediction or risk assessment, like warning signs or profiles, where you're talking about very broad things like criteria like, oh, they like violent video games, or they wear black clothing, or demographic things like they're all white boys and things like that. So there's things that are have been used out there. I'll talk about what that means that I think are problematic sort of solutions to this, whereas threat assessment was much more important in averting these events, and I'll talk about a little bit more about that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say sort of violence risk assessment, which is a multidisciplinary field. It attempts to estimate future violence potential. Various practitioners use this in the courts, in correctional facilities, mental health centers, and schools as well. And so you have various forms of this. You have profiling, and there have been various forms of school shooter profiles and classroom avenger profiles that have been created over the years. It's important to state there isn't one unifying profile that exists. It is true that they are more likely to be, white males. That's true, and that the schools, that where these type of events or mass shootings take place tend to be sort of suburban and rural areas that are predominantly white. That's true, but it's not true across the board, and I think it's important to recognize it's not true in every case, right? And warning signs, right, is the evaluation of the use of checklists of various risk factors, which are often quite broad. I mean, things like, doesn't like school has been mentioned before, obsession with violent video games, things like this. And these are often very problematic. Some of them are just not accurate. Some of them are just stereotypes. And almost all of them basically have an issue of false positives, right? Where you have, lots of students might not like school, lots of students might like violent video games, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be ever violent in any way throughout their lives, right? So it's not necessarily a good predictor. In contrast, we can talk about the threat assessment approach, which comes out of research and practice from the Secret Service, FBI, and various school districts over the years, focusing on the analysis of threats themselves, rather than predicting future behavior based on profiles, warning signs, or other sort of aggregate data in that way. You're trying to sort of assess the fact that, not all threats are equivalent, so it's important to look at the substance of the threat itself, right? So the threat assessment approach differs from previous attempts to sort of discern dangerousness because of its focus on the substantive analysis of existing threats. You're not predicting future behavior based on profiles, warning signs, and things like this. So the idea is there isn't one single homogeneous profile, but the evaluation of people's backgrounds, personalities, lifestyles, resources, these kinds of things can aid in determining the gravity of threats. And so a key component of school safety in this way gives schools an alternative to zero tolerance policies that have not been particularly effective, and can also sort of harm the school environment and make kids actually less likely to come forward. So it can be counterproductive in that way. And so what threat assessment entails, right, identifying student threats to commit violence, determining the seriousness of the threat, and developing intervention plans that protect potential victims and address the underlying problems or conflicts that stimulated the threatening behavior in the first place, which I think is a really key point. It's not just about, enhanced surveillance or punishment necessarily, but access, trying to solve conflicts, address, issues between students or between students and teachers, and sort of access social services in ways that can help people. And so part of this also is, right, looking at the context and the situation of these things. So again, sort of unlike zero tolerance sort of approach, which ignores context, right, you're concerned with assessing this interaction and dynamics between, the target situation and the person making the threat. Right, so that is the idea that there's a distinction between making a threat and posing a threat, right? Many people who make threats don't pose a serious risk to harm anyone, and conversely, many people who pose a serious risk of harm might not issue direct threats like immediately prior to the attack. So not all threats are equivalent. It's important to look at how sort of the substance of the threat, right? So how, for example, how direct it is, right? Did you threaten someone directly? And that's sort of a thing that makes it that we sort of see makes things more serious, take it more seriously. How detailed was it, right? Did you have detailed plans of who you're going to target, when, where, and how? How developed the threat was, right? Did someone already take out steps to carry it out? They already take actions based on this threat to carry out the threat. And how actionable it is, right? Did they have access to weapons? Is this a realistic threat that they could carry out if they wanted to, right? If someone threatens to blow up the moon, that's not a realistic threat, right? In the same kind of way. And so I want to talk about sort of one important distinction that scholars of threat assessment sort of have made, and I think is important to think about how we react to these things. And so there's a way to distinguish between sort of what we call transient threats and substantive threats, right? So transient threats, right? Statements that they don't express a lasting intent to harm someone, right? There may be figures of speech or feelings that quickly dissipate. So if you say, I'm going to kill you as a joke, right? Figure of speech in the heat of the moment, right? Temporary feelings, not a genuine expression, not enduring a sort of intent to harm someone. They quickly resolve. Typically, they end with maybe an apology or a clarification or something like that. In contrast to that, we can talk about substantive threats, right? These are statements that express a continuing intent to do harm, right? Desire to harm someone beyond the immediate incident or argument where the threat was made. So we're talking about, specific or plausible details, specific victim, time, place, method, things like that. Planning, substantial thought, maybe recruiting other people, things like this. These are sort of, physical evidence of intent to carry out the threat with hit lists or written plans or things like this. Where these are ones that really have to be taken much more seriously, right? So if you say, I'm gonna shoot Mr. Smith with my dad's shotgun next Tuesday at the CVS, right? That's a much more serious sort of substantive threat because it has these specific plausible details. And that's important to distinguish. So I'm gonna talk a little bit now about some of the research on threat assessment, some of my own research and research by other scholars on whether or not this stuff works. And so when I looked at these, when I went to these schools and talked to people and looked at these cases, what I found was that basically school officials and police officials kind of used all these different forms of risk assessment in different ways. They used some of the more problematic profiling and warning sign criteria, assessing, these instances based on ethnic or racial or gender sort of backgrounds of people committing these things or doing these things, making threats, previous misbehavior, mental health issues, as well as group characteristics, their social status, were they, loners, did they not have a lot of friends, or were they members of various, youth subcultures? Were they like goths or skinheads? Did they dress differently in different kinds of ways? So those things were criteria that people talked about and discussed and analyzed. But really the criteria that were most crucial in averting these incidents were the threat assessment criteria. So things like assessing the plot's detail, right? Were their victims targeted, location selected, date and timing planned? Did they have, access to weapons already, or the attempts to obtain or manufacture weapons? Did they practice, with these weapons in different ways? Did they, practice making pipe bombs in their backyard, as in one of the cases I looked at, right? So these threat assessment criteria were the crucial things to avert these events. They were the ones that were crucial in making decisions. They were the ones which gave all the people I talked to the most confidence in whether they correctly assessed the potential danger. They were the criteria that were most helpful, if prosecution or adjudication was necessary. These were the most sort of helpful criteria in that way as well. And they were really sort of the even if you had, if you had instances where you had a lot of the threat assessment criteria and not a lot of the profiling criteria, it was still taken seriously. Whereas the reverse happened, it didn't warrant the same kind of concern. So really we're crucial to assessing these instances and preventing them. And so the behavior that were really sort of most, warranted the most serious consideration were things like, planning, preparation, weapons acquisition, if there was training and rehearsals, were there scheduling certain times that they wanted to do these things, in the future, and did they have leakage? Did they threaten other people or tell other people about their plans, warn other people in that way? And so, for my research, right, in these cases, there's this potential to either exaggerate or dismiss, these kind of instances. There's various forms of violence risk assessment in how you evaluate these things, but the threat assessment criteria were really key towards prevention. They were valued, by far the most by school and police officials, and led to far more confidence in the assessments, far beyond that of any kind of profiling and warning sign criteria, these kind of criteria. And this speaks to the value of prevention, sort of this prevention model, which threat assessment adopts, and the value of looking at the context of situations over sort of zero tolerance. We'll talk a little bit about some of the research on threat assessment in general, and about the model that's used really throughout Washington State and Oregon as well, and some other places around the country. But the Salem-Keiser, or sometimes it's also called the Cascade Threat Assessment Model, created by John Van Driel, who is a school psychologist and the former director of safety and risk management services at the Salem Kaiser School District in Oregon. First developed in 1999, used certainly throughout the Northwest, but other parts of the country as well. And I think it's important that this approach really does focus on creating a positive school climate. Working against this code of silence, right? There is often a case that students, feel like, snitches get stitches and don't want to report things for a number of reasons. But the idea that you have to increase trust and in order to increase reporting behaviors and build this trusting relationship in order to prevent and intervene. And this emphasis on keeping students in school sort of is a really main focus of this model. And I want to mention another sort of key component that's maybe different about the Salem Kaiser or Cascade model than other models. And that's this sort of two-tiered system. So you have a level 1 team that is sort of based in the school. And every school, the idea that in this sort of school team, you have administrators who usually lead the effort. And then you have counselors or school psychologists, social workers, typically a school resource officer, and sort of they make decisions about what to do in response to a student threat. They often, will interview students, teachers, parents, anyone with pertinent information. And they generate interventions or resources and supports, for the student. And once they have the situation under control, they move forward with either, less supervision or some form of intervention or some solution, or they refer to a level 2 team. And so the level 2 team, this is a sort of a community collaboration consisting of various, public agencies that serve youth, sometimes additional local law enforcement, juvenile justice, people from Child Protective Services, things like this where appropriate. And there are some differences between the different models. Some models, there's a model in Virginia where you have to have, a teacher on a team. There's a model in Germany, which doesn't involve sort of law enforcement the same kind of way. So there's different approaches. But this is sort of the key approach that is used in throughout Washington State. And I'll mention, I am currently doing research on this. I've done interviews with threat assessment team members, and I'm doing some quantitative analysis of threat assessment data from Oregon as well currently, but that's very much sort of in the works. What we know about school threat assessment comes out of Virginia, and what's sort of sometimes referred to as the University of Virginia threat assessment model, or the model that's used in public schools in Virginia. And almost all research to date has been done on this model. Based on the work of Dr. Dewey Cornell, who's a professor at the University of Virginia. And in part that's because it was the first state to mandate threat assessment teams in all schools in 2013. And so that's where a lot of this, there's other research from Colorado I'll talk about in other places, but that's where the vast majority of empirical studies have come out of Virginia. And so I'll mention what some of the data shows, right? This is a study of 188 student threats in 35 schools across 1 year. And what they found was that 70% of cases were quickly resolved as transient threats. Remember, the less serious form of threats. 30% were deemed substantive and required more extensive evaluation and intervention. But you had 94 suspensions, but only 3 students expelled, and actually none of the threats of violence were carried out. So I think this really speaks to the utility of threat assessment over certainly over zero tolerance, where you don't need to suspend students in every case across the board, right? You can assess the substance of them and act accordingly. There's no need to take students out of school unnecessarily in that way. And talk about some other evidence from Virginia. And if you look at studies that compare over time and schools that did not have sort of threat assessment programs, and in schools with threat assessments, you did find that 99% of threats were not carried out. Only 1% of students were expelled, about 1% arrested. Lower levels of student aggressive behaviors. You did see reductions in suspension rates, which is key. Racial disparities were reduced or absent. I'll talk more about this in a moment from data from both Virginia and Colorado, but that's quite important considering that it's true in Washington State and throughout really the country that we do have still pretty disproportionate rates of punishment for students of color in lots of problematic ways. So this is an important sort of way to counteract that. You did see more use of counseling and a perception of a more positive school environment, both students reporting that the discipline was seen as more fair, and that teachers also felt safer. So these are sort of key findings of successes of threat assessment. I want to talk a little bit about threat assessment, school exclusions, and race as well, and to talk about disproportionality here. And so right, the goal is to address issues and conflicts and to provide support services, not just punishment. Sort of, as Ella mentioned, right, punishment decisions, sort of us having it being a independent process from this. And so the goal, right, is to keep students in school as much as possible and limit school exclusions, limit suspensions and expulsions to the greatest extent possible, unless they're absolutely necessary. And so what we found, if you look at the research, this is out of research out of Colorado, that there is some disparities in terms of who's referred to threat assessment teams, right? So you find that males, students in special education, and African Americans and Native American students were overrepresented in terms of who was referred to threat assessments. But what's important is that sort of if you think about what this process means, right? The issue is not necessarily just who gets sort of brought into a threat assessment team or who experiences a threat assessment, particularly if the threat assessment's goal is not just discipline, but to resolve issues or to find supportive services, right? So find a variety of responses that you can do, whether that's accessing mental health services, behavior support plans, referrals for special education evaluation, these kinds of things. Analysis found no disparities in outcomes, including disciplinary actions. When you compare across, looking at Black, Latinx, and white students receiving threat assessments, there were not sort of no significant differences between students also with and without disabilities as well. So the idea is that the outcome is, I think, the crucial thing to consider. And so as a result of that, I think we can think about threat assessment as being really sort of one of the most effective ways to reduce school exclusions and diminish and sort of even remove racial disparities for students of color. So we have to see this not merely as a way to assess threats, though it's much better than prior forms of risk assessments in doing that, but as a way to address issues and conflicts and to help students access services, as really as a way to support students. And so, from my interviews with threat assessment team members and coordinators in Washington, I do think that by and large, that is the approach that they are taking, to prioritize keeping students in school, not excluding students unnecessarily, and to find ways to actually address problems by locating supports and resources. And I think it's key that has to be the emphasis going forward. And that'll do it for me. I'd love to answer any questions that you have.
Jocelyn, have you gotten any questions in the Q&A that should get addressed? And everybody in the audience, if you do have a question for Eric, now's a great time to stick it in that Q&A, and we'll try and get some of them answered.
Yeah, there was a question for Dr. Eric. Could Eric also speak to the composition, training, and frequency of a level 2 team meets? For example, only on demand and not meeting throughout the year, or convening quarterly to calibrate and discuss.
So the question is about how often should the team meet? Yeah, I think that's maybe a good question for some of the practitioners in the room. Maybe that's a good question for people to talk about how often they meet and if they think that's a good approach. I mean, I think there's different models that people meet sort of, either periodically or when issues arise. I think it's probably more common that these teams meet when particular issues arise as opposed to having a standing meeting. But I think that's a great question for maybe the panel to talk about in practice, what they find and what they find to work best.
I don't mind addressing that if you like. We meet every 2 weeks during the school year. And we train the level 2 community members on threat assessment as well. But it's regular meetings. I mean, that way, basically, we don't want a student be wait too long for, you know, the community team. But that's 2 weeks seems to work pretty good. Not all ESDs follow that same format, but that's what we do in our Educational Service District 113.
Thanks,
The
Dan.
next question, is it suggested to suspend a student while awaiting completion of threat assessment, or can a student remain in school?
Do you mind if I take that one? So as I mentioned in the beginning, we do not recommend this, and I'll let Dan maybe expand on this a little bit about why we want to try and keep students in school. But as a reminder, the legislation and the requirements under the RCW actually prohibit this unless something that occurred is actually something that would be a suspendable or expellable occurrence under the actual student discipline rules. You cannot suspend or expel a student purely for having to refer a student to or completing a threat assessment process. Dan, did you want to maybe expand on that a little, or Eric expand on that a little bit more about why we want to keep kids in school?
Sure, I don't mind taking that. You know, schools are the safest environment for kids. It really is. A lot of these students may have dysfunctional families at home. They may be struggling. Schools can be a supportive environment. We can, you know, we've got eyes on these students when they're at school. We can do all kinds of supports at school. If they're at home, there's the possibility of perseveration, planning, you know, for an event, and we don't want that to happen. So really, we try to keep students in school as much as we possibly can. Eric, anything further?
Yeah, I think I just sort of point out that in the vast majority of these incidents, we're not talking about these kind of serious cases where you're going to have, you know, an impending, you know, sort of violent attack. And so to the extent possible, right, you do want to not disrupt students' education. You want to keep them in school to the greatest extent possible, unless it's absolutely necessary and there is like a real, you know, threat to someone. That is sort of, I think, should be the default, that you want to maintain sort of students in school so that they're not, you know, you're not further exacerbating their conflicts or issues that they might have, and keep them in school as great as much as possible.
All right, we'll do one more question. Does the research address the effectiveness of threat assessments in districts and/or schools that have implemented multi-tiered systems of support with fidelity?
So what do you say? So we're talking about have they evaluated threat assessments that have I'm sorry, I'm not sure. Can you say the question again? I don't see it here.
Yeah. Does the research address the effectiveness of threat assessments in districts and/or schools that have implemented multi-tiered systems of support with fidelity?
I mean, I think the simple answer to that is no. I think there's still pretty limited research in terms of looking at the ways in which threat assessment has been implemented. As I mentioned, right, that you know, it really comes out of Virginia and a few preliminary studies out of Colorado, and there's a couple in Texas and a couple other places, but there's not a lot of research in general at that sort of nailing down the substance of what works best and best practices. And I think there's a lot more need for this kind of stuff. This is, you know, frankly, some of the stuff I'm trying to do now, and look at what's going on across the Northwest. But I think there's a need for a lot more research in a lot of this area for sure.
All right, team. Thank you, Dr. Madfis. I think we should all give him a collective reaction button, applause, or what have you. And thank you so much for all of your awesome information about what to do. We are going to continue with our panel and hear from them as well, but lots of love in and the reactions. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all.
So next, we are going to go to the practitioner side. We're going to hear from Dan Beaudoin, excuse me. He's our comprehensive school safety coordinator from ESD 113. We also have with us Stephanie Edler. She's a mental health program manager for Seattle Public Schools. Welcome. We're glad that you're here. And yeah, at this point, we're gonna talk questions a little bit. So, Dan, your role at the ESD is to provide the training around threat assessment. Can you talk a little bit about what the training is and what role the ESD plays?
Sure. We offer a 2-hour training. I mean, these trainings John Van Driel does like 2-day, week-long type trainings and gets into a lot of depth. But John Van Driel, the architect of our threat assessment system, he says he can get the point across within 15 minutes. And basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to, first of all, assess risk, but then also provide supports for students. And that's really what it comes down to. So we've got a protocol that we follow, that we try to train these school districts in following the protocol and, assembling teams to determine risk.
And Stephanie, you took part in those teams. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the experience was like for you? How did you end up joining the team, and what was the experience behind it?
Yeah, so I joined the district down here at the district office in 2022, and historically our threat assessment process was housing security. And so we decided, based off just some of the characteristics and needs, that we brought it to the mental health team. And so I coordinate our threat assessment consulting process here at the district that collaborates with our school teams, that aligns with our policy and procedure. So it's really a collective effort that follows the Salem-Kaiser model to hopefully support and decrease any threats we have in our community and build a supportive wraparound support for each of our students if there is a threat that is made.
Awesome. So Dan, I'm not a principal. I've never been a principal. So can we imagine for a moment that I am a principal? What happens if I get a threat and I think it might be credible? I think it could happen tomorrow. What do I do?
First of all, don't panic, because a lot of these threats, they're reactionary events, and panicking isn't going to solve anything. We need to look at the situation realistically. I mean, that's the primary thing. So if you're a principal, bring in a counselor, possibly your law enforcement. If you've got an SRO or a security person, bring them in and talk about the situation. That's the first thing you do is make a determination. Is this a reactionary event, or is there something more substantive that we need to look into? Do we need to get our threat assessment level 1 committee together to look further into this? If that's the decision, that quick decision, then that's what you do. You follow through on the protocol, the threat assessment protocol, to determine the amount of risk. And so on that team, if you've got, for instance, it's a special ed student, then you would have a special ed person on the team. You'd have a counselor, possibly the nurse may be involved at the school, the administrator, your SRO or SSO may be involved, but that team would go through the protocol and make a determination of risk. And then also, most importantly, is supports for the student. From there, they also make a determination, do we need to go to a level 2? Do we need to get further supports from the community level 2 team that Dr. Madfis talked about? And so that's a determination that you make when you follow the protocol, but it covers everything. I think it's 17 pages long, so it covers a lot of things. You answer basically 12 fundamental questions to determine if we need to look into this further. So it's not daunting to do the process, is what I'm trying to say here. Once you answer those 12 questions, then you get an idea how severe this is.
Yeah, and that training, I think, and that document come with the training provided by the ESD, is that right?
Yes. And that's the main document that we use, is what we call the protocol. But there's also supporting documents. We have teacher interview forms, we have a student interview form, we have parent interview forms, those kind of things. One thing I'm going to mention, and I say this over and over again in the trainings, please, if you're expelling a student or sending a student home, please do that interview with the student while you've got them at the school, because once they get home, it's really difficult, to get additional information. And that's part of this protocol is really getting our information together. So it's very important to sit down with that student and talk about what happened, get their perspective on what happened. And we've got a form to use to fill that out.
Awesome. Yeah, I know that, the reason the form isn't just published is so that you get the accompanying information and the plan around it and a more comprehensive look than just the form. Because I know we all want to cherry pick, right? It makes it a little easier. But it's worth it to go to the training and to get more information, I think. So Stephanie, you were on a threat assessment team. Where did your work begin, and what's the district support look like with that work? What's the ongoing commitment?
Yeah, historically, I'm coming from community mental health. And so I am, as a clinician, I'm trained in, assessing for suicidality and homicidality. So that's originally kind of where my roots have been, where I've started, and then being in comprehensive middle school for Seattle Public Schools. A lot of times, some of my case management kids were students who had made threats as well. So I was a part of that process and that consultation piece within that team, within the building, and with district staff to kind of talk about, again, plans, access, mental health needs, what supports are already in place, to try to, again, keep our student or my students in school. I think Eric and Dan both spoke really beautifully about the importance of having our students stay in the most safest community, as well as we have access to see them. When they're out in community, we don't know what's going on. So when we have them with us, we're able to ensure safety, provide supervision, and then have a lot of those discussions to gather information to kind of figure out what is going on and perpetuating these choices or behaviors for our students who are making threats or being threatened against. And so with that being said, coming into the district and having some of that experience, looking at, again, our updated policy and procedure that aligns with our Salem-Kaiser, which is a model we've been using historically for quite some time. And then providing training and ongoing support for our staff to understand, how do we assess these risks in a way that is productive, non-biased, and recognizing that suspension and disconnecting from the educational environment is not the solution and doesn't change anything. And then with that being said, continuing to grow our community in being able to assess appropriately, looking at it as a collaborative effort and a need that is not being met, and how do we, again, triage that support in a collaborative way that it's not one person making a decision, it's a team effort that includes family, student, other, portions of the community or in school who know that student best, that can really provide us information. Again, as we look at how do we, again, support the student best. So within the district, we are, constantly evolving. That is, again, aligned with our policy procedure and where our environment is right now. I think it's fair to say that our threats within our community has significantly risen since the pandemic. And so we are constantly triaging and being mindful that we have impacted staff and students and families, where that bias piece is really becoming kind of tough in terms of when we're asking these questions and utilizing the documents, as Dan reported, the interview form for teachers, for students, for witnesses, for the aggressor as well, just to make an informed decision that ultimately provides enough support and keeps our community safe to an extent.
Yeah, so thinking about parents, I'm sure that that throws an extra wrinkle into things. Do y'all have recommendations for parent contact, or what does that look like?
Yes, we want parents to attend our level 1 meeting that we have at the schools, as long as they're amenable to the process, as long as they're willing to work with us, because they can be so supportive at home. You know, you know, they need to see that this protocol is not punitive, that it's really, we're trying to find supports for this student. Thing is if we don't fix the student while they're at school, you know, later on in life, they become a bigger problem for our community. So we want to try and get students on the right path as soon as possible, as young as possible. You know, it's so important. So we want the parents there. You know, if they're adversarial to the process, that's going to be difficult. If they bring a lawyer to the meeting, you know, that makes it even more difficult, and we can't hold a meeting basically if there's a lawyer present. So, you know, we want to work with the parents. So it's important to get that message out that this is a supportive process.
I also just want to add in I just want to differentiate that it's not just parents, it could be guardians. I also want to look at the dynamic of our community in regards to knowing that our students are also potentially have guardianships or in foster care or in other aspects. That is, again, that point of contact for us as who is ever providing them with our stability outside the community, that they're involved as well. I always coach out to our schools. It's really about the way you're communicating this process. Oftentimes the word threat is very triggering for a lot of our community. So when I'm speaking about it, I'm saying, here's the circumstances, this is where we're at. We would love to invite you in and get your voice and your perspective of what the circumstances are. Like, how can we meet you at that, you know, in the middle ground so we can, again, help support your students. It's really advocating, like, this is about support and what can we do in these things, rather so than leading into, you know, we are concerned about this threat. Did your child have access to weapons and all those different things? So it's really, again, like, this is collaborative. We see you as a parent, as a guardian, a huge part of this process, and we'd love to invite you in to help us support your child in the situation that's happening at school.
Yeah, the involvement. I think, yeah, the framing of it matters so much. It's a little adversarial. When it comes to like supports, like the wraparound supports, I'm just curious, like, we got a question in the chat about, like, do you see them happening for like a long term, or is it usually like, or is it the beginning of a long-term relationship with things like, you know, counseling or what have you, or are they usually kind of short-term relationships that you just put into place for a little bit?
It really, for us, depends on our plan. So if we have we don't call it a safety plan, we call it, oh my gosh, a care plan, because the word safety also can have some negative connotations around the student is unsafe. Yeah. And within that plan, we do suggest that, like, after a couple of weeks, you guys revisit, come back together. And again, depending on the level and the need of the student, we do suggest that, like, you connect as a group, just like we would in any wraparound services, whether it's bi-weekly or monthly, to check in and then adjust those plans as needed as things become more stable and maybe some intensive supports aren't needed or more intensive supports are as that team collaborates. So that would be our suggestion.
Awesome. I'm also wondering about social media. I know social media can add like another whole layer to any of this. So once the community gets the hold of, like, there's a threat, they're canceling school on Tuesday, or, you know, what have you, that kind of stuff. Do you have any recommendations around responding to social media, or when things get—
Yes, I do. You know, social media, if you don't get on top of it right away, you're going to have so many rumors out there. It's really important for school districts to get a message out. There's always a balance between too much information, too little information, but you've got to get something out. What that does is it dispels the rumors, okay? It also says, hey, we've got this under control, this situation. We've got a protocol that we follow. We know what we're doing. So important.
Yeah, and I see in the chat, someone said responding to social media is a great source for leakage. do you find, is there substantial information that you might get out of looking at social media stuff? Or is that an expectation of school employees to be looking at it?
That's a tough one. I think a lot of school districts try to stay on top of social media as much as they can, but there's so many avenues nowadays to try and keep on top of it. There are some software solutions to that as well, but it's difficult. It is really difficult. I think that messaging piece, though, is so important that you've got to respond as quickly as you can with something. It stops the rumors. That's the biggest problem we have, is the rumors.
For Seattle Public Schools, we have cybersecurity that flags any content that is being used. If it's on an SPS device and goes to our safety and security, I get looped in and then we inform the school. So we do have some protective factors that helps us, but it's not, there's, like Dan said, a million other platforms that we don't have access to that aren't on our SPS devices. And so I think, to Dan's point, we try to minimize rumor control as fast as possible, but we're not perfect at it. And social media spreads like wildfire, but it can also heighten anxiety and really make it more difficult to really assess and screen out like what is happening. But we also, at the same time, can be helpful in the sense of people are reporting to us what, if they know who is posting it, more context to it at the same time. Not that I'm advocating that people go out there and post these things, but at the same time, as a threat assessment manager, I do at times utilize the social media aspects to help me connect who is making the threat and other students that potentially would be involved.
Sure. I wondered a little bit about, Dan, I know that like you've used threat assessments, and do you have any like success stories that you'd be willing to share around them, and a time when it made a difference for a student?
It's really difficult for schools, for administrators to deal with these kind of situations. And I understand it. We had a situation where a student had been expelled for months, because it was a serious problem. I won't get into the details, but the district tried to bring that student into a different school, and there was community response that the administrators had to deal with because word got out about what had happened months previous, and it was a situation where they didn't want, the community didn't want the student at the school. Well, we're talking about a young student here, and anyway, at the meeting we had a very long discussion, and things turned around during the meeting where they were willing to bring in the student part-time to start with. And as I was just I've been sort of following this, and it's a success story because the student is now at school on the right track. They're off that pathway to violence. Things are working. And this is, the earlier we can catch these students, the sooner we can get them off the pathway to violence, the sooner we can give them the right type of supports. All of it works. It really does. So it is a success story. Just getting that student back in school, socialization, being with a pro-social adult. That's the number one thing. Connection with a pro-social adult really helps these students. So, success story.
I think another part of that, just to add into it, is we're trying to do a better job and increase our psychoeducation to families around threats and students who make threats. I think some of that is we can't help what we don't know, and there's a fear, right? I'm sending my child into a school that might be unsafe. And so I think there's some pieces that we're at Seattle Public Schools are trying to grow in terms of providing that content to not only our students, our staff, but our families as well. Is also recognizing that we have due process and students have rights at the same time. And we're here to advocate for those rights and communicate that, not all student information is public knowledge, that there is confidentiality to that, as well as we want to advocate that our students, every single student in our school has the right to be at school at the same time. So I know it can feel a little bit sticky because I get being a parent and having that fear. It's very, very, very real. But we also want to be mindful that we're not here to violate any students' rights in order to their education.
Yeah. Well, and I remember as a teacher, I mean, I had a student who, had been involved in incarcerated briefly, and they had told me about it, but they didn't tell me why, and I didn't have any context, and I never knew what happened to that student or what their story was. And I think it is helpful to have information and to humanize them as like everybody makes mistakes and they're just kids, they need our help. So
and that's it. We need to treat students as, kids as kids, and they're not adults. We shouldn't be treating them as adults. So, we can help them.
do you collaborate with other programs like special education or McKinney-Vento or any like?
Yeah, I in fact, for our level 1 team, we do recommend that the school district make sure that if it's a special education student, that they have a special education person on that team for the level 1 assessment. On our level 2, the community-based team, we have a special ed director from our ESD that attends that, because currently we're seeing between 30 and 50% of our cases are special ed students. So it's really important to have that representation there. In fact, it's critical.
And I would agree. We bring in anyone, again, within the school community that has knowledge and contact with that student, whether it's SPED, McKinney-Vento, our foster care liaison, any community-based organization, the lunch lady, whoever it is that might have a really positive relationship with that student that can give us context. We invite into those meetings. And then at the district level, we have discipline, we have our restorative practices team, we have our nurses, we have our school counseling, our social work. So we bring a multidisciplinary team together if it appears appropriate and helpful to, again, be a part of that conversation that has different layers of context and background and knowledge to help provide us with some informed decisions.
Awesome. As people are getting their teams together, do you have any advice for the teams as they're forming and just revisiting their protocols and things like that?
Do I have any? Well, we want to make sure that we've got everybody trained. I mean, that's super important that we, whoever's on your team. But like I said earlier, you want to make sure that you've got, an administrator has to run the protocol. We can, and that's the thing we do as well, is if it's your first time running one of these level 1 threat assessments, we offer to go out and attend that meeting. We'll be there, from a procedural point of view, just to help the process. We won't run the meeting for you. We want the school district to run the meeting, but we'll be there to help out as much as we can. But on that team, you want to make sure you've got a counselor, you've got possibly a nurse, law enforcement in the form of SSO or SRO. You want to have, the idea is to have a multidisciplinary team, different points of view, to do a proper risk assessment and to come up with the supports.
And just to piggyback on what Dan said, I think I just encourage, this is not something to be done alone. This is something to be done with the team. This is not a one-person decision-making. This is a collaborative effort. So that it's a shared responsibility in terms of moving forward of how to ensure safety and how to, again, wrap around the student. So there's a lot of fear in it, 100%. I just want to acknowledge that, even as someone who's done a lot of the threat assessments and then been in pretty high stakes situations here at Seattle Public Schools, it feels refreshing and secure to know that I have a team that is carrying this along with me, that I'm not doing this by myself. And that there is a protocol and processes and the Sam Kaiser that helps guide my practices to help me ensure that I'm doing something that's evidence-based and supportive.
Well, thanks, y'all. I appreciate your time this morning to tell us a little bit about your experience. We are gonna go back to these slides. And everybody, can we show a round of applause for our awesome presenters today? We appreciate our panel so much. We know that it's tough to leave your space, especially this time of year, and as January is, and it's great to get on the ground information about what does it look like to really do this work. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so just as a friendly reminder, we really do hope you get the training, and it's okay if you don't know what to do, you just got to know who to call. So we have a contact list for you that's included in our care package, and we want to make sure that you have that. It's in our resource sheet. It's also linked up here. So we hope that this information doesn't just stay in this webinar. We hope that you talk to your leadership team about it, or your PLC, or even maybe talk with some more students. Resources. So our resources today, we always put a plug in for how to use funding. We have our Engaged newsletter, and we have an article in there from Eric this month, as well as some really cool resources to help you find your threat assessment coordinator. We have a threat assessment page from OSPI that is super cool. And we have a couple of articles from Eric that are worth checking out. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about his research and the work he's done, these are good resources. We have a button. So if you want to connect with OSPI staff or follow up on this webinar in any way, you can use that link to get to the right person. And just want to say our Engage newsletter is pretty informative. It's aligned to our webinars each month. It's supposed to be leadership team focused, and so hopefully the things in there are things you can use right away and are relevant to the time of year. Next month, we're going to be talking about balanced calendar and scheduling. It's going to be a really great webinar. We're excited to have some folks joining us to talk about what it looks like in their school district. And as you're planning your schedule for this next year, it'll be a great resource just to consider changing up a little bit. We do have an evaluation, which I'm going to launch right now. This helps us adjust our offerings each month. And as we have done this webinar for quite a few years now, it's better because of the things that y'all tell us, and we try to practice continuous improvement. We have a short form evaluation that I just launched in the polls, but after this webinar, you should also get a link to our feedback survey. I just want to encourage you, if you have presenters that you want to be involved in the webinar also, it's a good place to go. Or if you want us to change the time or what have you, we're always interested in your feedback. We'd love to see our listeners get clock hours for joining us. If you joined live, you've already registered for the year through Zoom. You'll also need to register for clock hours monthly in PD Enroller. PD Enroller is, they're going to send you an evaluation for your email, and then we verify your attendance and we release your hours. If you're watching this video later on, the process will change. You register each month for clock hours in PD Enroller, and you complete the evaluation, and you'll also do our graduation equity feedback survey just to signal to us that you watched. We'll verify your attendance every couple weeks, and we release your clock hours that way. And if you have questions about this, please email Ronnie Larson, who does our clock hours support. She's awesome. She'll help you out. Thank you for checking out our webinars. We'll see you next month.